When I put this book out, it was like I came out of the closet with God. My family was like, what is going on? Who are you? They had no idea. My mother had to come to grips with the fact that she did not know who I was. It's been my experience that what we call the words of God, they're understood by everybody at face value. We feel the truth of them. But as time goes on and as we're evolving and we're growing, we come to understand those truths deeper and deeper. This voice was saying to me, like, don't be afraid. This is why you came. But the new and the unknown can be so big and so unknown, we almost can't help but fear. And we have to kind of master that fear, because that's usually when the biggest, most incredible spiritual breakthroughs happen. But welcome a little bit of the unknown and the fear. I'm telling you, that's where it's at.
So in this episode, I am talking to Kevin Grant. He is the author of the book, What the Hell is Hell? And I met Kevin at a week-long meditation retreat put on by Dr. Joe Dispenza. And I remember him really well because I sat next to him during a meditation that I felt just really afraid of. Fear was just a huge theme for me that week. And I sat next to him and just immediately felt a sense of calmness and peace, and he's turned into a friend and a mentor to me. And not only did he kind of ease my nerves on going into these longer meditations, but also he has written an entire book that deals with kind of easing your nerves around the idea of hell, and he comes at it with a really unique perspective that I really have enjoyed reading, and I think could help a lot of people. So we'll just jump into this. It was recorded a little bit ago, but I wanted to do it right and edit a little intro for it. You could tell by my haircut that it's taken me a minute. It's a really good conversation, and Kevin is just a really experienced meditator and seeker, and so he just has a lot of wisdom that he dropped on this one, and I hope you enjoy it.
I really admired it, and I think it's always pretty brave when somebody's willing to go out there and say, hey, I think I heard this from God, because it's just it can get so volatile.
Yes. Yeah. It took,
Yeah.
and you can ask me questions and we can just talk along the way. I mean, I'm sure it's cool for me to ask you some questions along the way, right? Because, yeah, I had to jump through rings of fire, man. Like, you will never know. No one will ever know what it took to end up in that place. I mean, I was a businessman, you know? When I put this book out, it was like I came out of the closet with God. My family was like, what is going on? Who are you? They had no idea. My mother had to come to grips with the fact that she did not know who I was. She thought she knew, but she was just in shock, you know? It was really interesting. So first I got the frantic text. You know, are you a born-again Christian? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Just read the book, Mom. And actually, the fact that she understood the book and liked it so much was like, I knew that if she could understand it, anyone could. Because she's atheist, born Jewish, like couldn't be further from knowing anything about Christianity.
Wow. And she read it and liked it, and then did that just completely surprise you?
It did. And I knew that my mother is an avid reader. Like, she reads a lot. And so she wasn't just saying this to me to be a mom. She was blown away. She wrote me a letter that I have never received any sort of praise approaching. The letter opened up, "My dearest Kevin." I was like, what? Like, never since I've been on this earth for 50 plus years has she ever opened a communication like that. You know, both her and her husband were just totally blown away. They didn't know, like, the level of research and the spiritual intelligence of it. They just, you know, they thought I was this guy who had a lobster company exporting live lobster, and, you know, they just didn't know this whole other side of me because I always kept it, you know, close to the chest sort of thing.
Wow. And so nobody had any clue because you were working on this for a while, and it would take a lot of study on your part, to really do your due diligence on scripture and translations and stuff like that. What was the process like, and was anybody in the loop during that time, or were you just kind of on your own,
I was totally on my
just
own.
feeling?
I've always been, I was 19 years of my adult life, I was an entrepreneur, businessman. And I was always the type of guy that, I'm not going to tell anybody about a project I'm doing. Then when it succeeds, I tell people, here you go. Because what happens is when you're shooting for the stars, and I mean really shooting for the stars, like I was working on a project with Disney. I was the only American they gave restaurant space to in their new Shanghai location. And it's like when you tell people what you have in mind, if you fail, then they say, we always knew he was crazy. When you succeed, we always knew he was a genius. And so with this book, it was just a total, utter passion project. I had always been writing the book. I don't know if I told you this ever, but it was really fascinating. So what happened was the shit hit the fan in business in 2015, and I was at a crossroads. I could either resurrect my business and go on, or I had this whole, I guess I can say this because I have the words of God in the book. I really felt like God had said to me, you can build up another empire, but I'm just going to swat it over. So what are you going to do? This has happened to me 2 times in 2 decades. I built up a big company, everything went to hell. I built up another company, everything went to hell. And because when you get into big, big dollar amounts, the things people are capable of are just breathtaking. And so I realized at this moment that I'd been writing, it had been my greatest passion since, for years and years, decades. And so I came to this conclusion that I had to write this book. I was going to go crazy. At that moment, in that period of my life, I was inundated with so many synchronicities and so many things saying, yes, you're going the right way. So what happened, Nathan, is all of the book used to be only chapter 15. That first chapter, when you got into part 3, that was the whole book. It was word for word from my notebook. I told the story in the book of what happened. I was driving home from Canada, a long 9-hour drive, and was just overtaken. So the spiritual parts of the book came very fast. Then I spent 14,000 hours doing research to make sure that all of these messages were corroborated in the Bible and in harmony with what Jesus said. And I say in the introduction to the book, I spent 14,000 hours. I'm sure a lot of people might think I just pulled that number out of my butt. But I took a job because I wasn't going to be crazy and just jump off the cliff. And so I was writing every morning before work, every evening after work, all weekends and all vacations. So I knew my time. This went on for 3 years. It took me to do that. And then what happened was I published the book, and several people had written me emails and whatnot saying things like, you freed me from a lifetime of fear. Thank you. And that was it. I was hooked for life. There's no amount of business I've ever done or money I've ever made. Honestly, I'm not just saying this. Nothing ever equaled how fulfilled I was to really help someone and help people. So at that moment, the only thing left was I was a little bit insecure as to my research because I didn't have, I needed to get it vetted. And so I had reached out to a couple of Bible scholars, and I worked with a couple of graduate students. But then one day I'm kind of struck by a bolt of lightning to write a letter to my hero. He is the most renowned Bible scholar on the planet, in my opinion. His name's Dr. Bart Ehrman. His books are on my shelves. He's written 34 books, 6 New York Times bestsellers. He's a distinguished professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the man. So I sent him the book, and I said, look, I'm really trying to help people, and I've already been helping people. Will you vet my work? And those 2 weeks, so we go back and forth. He finally agrees to read the book. Those 2 weeks were, you can imagine how tough that was. I'm waiting for this guy to rip my work to shreds. And he writes me back this, like in a paragraph in an email, he says, I like the book. Just like that. I said, maybe you could tell me a little more. He agrees to do an interview with me, and we do this 2-hour interview for YouTube on his YouTube channel. And he tells me that he not only likes the book, that he's never known a layman that has done the kind of research I have, and he also said that I could reach people he never could because he's an atheist, and a lot of Christian thinks he's going to burn in hell anyway, so they won't listen to him. So we really became sort of allies because we both shared one core belief that people should think for themselves and that they should search for the truth wherever it leads. And so that's kind of the story of the book in a nutshell.
One of my favorite lines in the book is, you can be scared into believing something called the truth, but you can't be scared into knowing it is the truth. I love that.
I'm so glad.
Man, it's I'm trying to even think where to start because there's so many parts of the book I really enjoyed. I think even just how you open it, when you're talking about it hit you when you were driving, were you expecting that at all? Had you had any sort of moments like that beforehand?
Yes. So it was the sort of thing where I had been receiving information from honestly, it started when I was 14 years old. I became to cherish the time at night when you lie down to go to sleep and all the lights are out. And I would always be sort of talking to God and to spirit. And I used to call it the book of the universe, that I would sort of open this book at night, and I came to find that like the next night when I would come back, somehow I would be at the same place and go further. And then one day I started getting like somebody was talking back, but it took me into my teens to kind of be able to discern what was God and what was not. And as I say in my book, and for anybody listening, God is a vocabulary word. It's the best we have. So when I say God, there's a lot behind that. It's really not what most people would call God. But the way it really worked, Nathan, is that so I was studying the Bible as I was a teenager. I was always a seeker. But in my 20s, I started receiving like very specific information about Christian theology. And the way I would know that it wasn't my own thoughts is that in the years when this first started, in my mid-20s, coming out of college, I had a contracting company. I was painting and sheetrocking. And, there would be times I would come home covered in paint, like washing my hands, and all of a sudden download about the Gospel of John. And to tell you the truth, every time I would pursue the writing, my life would get so messed up. It would be like I would say, okay, I'm going to pursue this writing now, and I would start to write the book. And everything in my life would go into shambles. Sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. And you want to hear a crazy story? This is the truth. This is a story I don't tell people, Nathan. But if we're already talking about receiving words from God, so what happened was, where I made the transition to taking all this seriously, I started thinking I was insane. Like, not he's crazy, like clinically insane. I'm born in a Jewish house, and I'm receiving information about Christian theology. And I've always been a very skeptical, rational person. And so this is all happening where my life is getting messed up from me pursuing this. And I had this friend who always went to psychics and mediums, and I used to make fun of him. One day he tells me there's this medium you need to go and see. I promise he's the real deal. He lets you record and the session. So the only way to get into this guy's appointment is you have to call up on the last Tuesday of every month between 10 and 2 o'clock. He's very popular. This is in New York, when I lived in Long Island, New York. And so it's like calling into a radio talk show. So October, I call up, busy signal for 4 hours, I don't get through. I call in November, busy signal 4 hours, don't get through. In December, I get an appointment that happens to be on my 30th birthday. So I'm driving to this guy's office, and I'm in my car, and I look up and I say, I don't know who you are. Are you God? Are you spirit? Are you a guide? Whoever it is that's responsible for all the information, all the synchronicities, all of this stuff, this is your chance to show me that you're real, because I'm done. I really am questioning my sanity. My life is going to shit. And I meant it. I was like, this is it. So I get to this guy's office, just a regular guy, no frills office, hits record on the tape. He closes his eyes, kind of moves his hand on this pad, and he says, this is really interesting. Normally I'm speaking to people who are crossed over. He's like, but this is more like a guide on a different level, and they were waiting for you when you came in. And he said, the first thing I'm supposed to tell you is you're not crazy. Okay. I'm keeping my mouth shut because I don't want to give this guy any information. And he says, you lead two lives. It's like everybody knows you as this person who's running your company. And he goes, but then you have this whole other life where you're receiving information. I'm seeing you scribbling it in notebooks. And I mean, it was a 40-minute long reading, but it was just unbelievable that he was telling me this. And he says to me, one day you're going to end up putting this all in a book. Little did I know it would be almost 20 years later. And he even went so far, and this is really funny. He says, now I'm getting your mother's father. He names his name. And when I was 26 years old and I started putting together the lobster company, that was when I first got into the lobster business. And it was weird. My grandfather died when I was 8. But when I was putting this company together, I felt his presence in the room. Never felt that after or before. And so he tells me, your grandfather says when you were starting your business, he was around, and he just wanted to let you know that was him. Your grandfather wants me to tell you that he acknowledges all this spiritual stuff going on, but that you need to keep your feet on the ground. Put gas in your car. And so I had this dichotomy going on. But when I left that reading, I walked into that reading a skeptical man of all of this, even of mediums. I thought was complete bullshit. When I left that office, I was a different human being. This guy said so many things that you could never look up on any computer. So anyway, long story short, that's how I first realized, okay, you're not insane. From there, he told me that it would be like learning to play the piano, that the more I let the information come, the more they're able to give me the information. The more I work on tuning myself to receiving it, the more I will know when it's coming. That leads us, I'm getting information, and then when I'm 36 years old, I'm driving home from Canada, and shazam. You know, I've never had a download like that before. Where it was just, that went on for 6 hours. Want to hear something funny? My editor, when I told the truth in the introduction, the truth is I kept on driving. I'm driving with one hand and scribbling all this stuff down page after page. My editor said, you can't say that in the book because people will be worried you're going to crash and it's not safe. So in the book, I tell a little fib that I pulled over. Here I am exposed on Nathan's. So that's the story.
Oh, man, and it just kept coming to you. You're for, you said 6 hours, your whole drive, pretty much.
6 hours. And here's the crazy part, Nathan, as if this isn't crazy enough. In the years that followed of editing the book, so that chapter, as I say in the introduction, that sat in my closet for 10 years. That's how long it took me to get the courage. I mean, I had God talking to me in a notebook, Nathan. Are you kidding me? Like, I'm going to put this in a book? I was a lobster businessman, traveling like to China on business. It got to a point where, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
Having those stowed away and having the book basically in your closet, the writings for 10 years.
Yes. So in the years when I started writing the book, I went through multiple editors. I ended up with 2 very serious editors who worked on it with me. Then I worked with Dr. Bart Ehrman on vetting, and he didn't fundamentally, like for the most part, he just helped me tweak little things of history and interpretation and scholarship. The crazy thing is, every sentence in that book from beginning to end was edited and worked on. Every single sentence crafted and so much work put into it, so much work, thousands of revisions. The chapter from my notebook, like barely a word changed through all those rounds of editing. It just stood there like granite. And that also told me something. I had to build a few bridges here and there because sometimes the voice would just go from here to here with no connection. So there'd be but other than that, all of that material, I still have my notebook, and you can see that chapter just unfolding. So that was really fascinating to me. And more evidence that this didn't come from me, And then in the other chapters, there was just some other scattered stuff from that notebook.
And the timing of it, isn't that interesting? It was like you needed to wait until you were ready and things were ready. Had you not had the experiences you had leading up to, even that drive, you probably wouldn't have been able to receive that, and or at least even give it credit, and write it down.
And besides that, Nathan, and this also is completely crazy, that it almost took me 10 years to actually understand the very words that I wrote down. So there was also this whole process of me coming. Do you know that to this day, sometimes I will understand something in the book that I've never quite, I understand it in a more profound way. It's been my experience that what we call the words of God, they're understood by everybody at face value. We feel the truth of them. But as time goes on and as we're evolving and we're growing, we come to understand those truths deeper and deeper. Like even Jesus telling people, love one another or love your neighbor. You see that at first, oh, that's a beautiful thing. Then if you remember, I tell a story in my book that maybe one day you see an old man struggling with his groceries and you go to help him. And as he drives away, you feel this goodness and this reward. And then it occurs to you, wow, this is why it's just better and nicer to love others and to give to others. And you understand more profoundly why Jesus was teaching this. That sort of thing, and that you come to understand it on the deepest level, that if we all loved one another, what a world it would be,
What was your perspective on hell before you started getting these signals? Was this different? Did this surprise you, or were you leaning this way a little bit and this just kind of pushed you over the edge?
I always instinctively thought it was bullshit. However, a part of me, what if? That's what led me to do all of this research. That's what drove me, that I needed to understand this business about hell. Because even though I was brought up Jewish, it doesn't matter what religion you are. Culturally, we're taught about hell. We have movies, serious movies, and you have comedies, somebody getting tossed into hell, and we see these comic strips with people on spits being turned. You can't help wonder, what does this all mean? And I think the fact that I was raised, my family, everyone in my family is atheists, even though they're Jewish culturally. My extended family has people some of which are religious and believe in God. My family was never religious. They're all atheists. Why I believed in God since I was 5 years old is a mystery. My grandfather, the one who died, I think he believed in God, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so growing up Jewish, I needed to know what all the hubbub was about this Jesus guy. And then I tell the story of what happened when I was 7, of a mystical experience at my babysitter's house at Easter, where I felt this spirit. It wasn't just love. It was like this whole other thing going on. And that planted the seed in me really, really young. And that's why I started reading the Gospels when I was a teenager. Like there was something about those words. And so then I had to say, well, okay, I see the value in who Jesus was. I don't know what to make of him at this point, but now this makes hell all the more. I need to look into this because what if? What if it's real? And so that led to the research. And the research on hell, you have to go into the Old Testament, as you know from my book. Yeah.
Why that moment happened where your babysitter invited you over for Easter? It seemed like such a kind of like synchronicity to me.
Like life synchronicity. That one is still the biggest mystery to me because number one, in this day and age, such a thing would never happen. My mother has no memory of this. It was that my brother used to beat me up on a regular basis, and I know that it was my babysitter looking out for me. She knew that when she left that day, I was going to be an open target. But I mean, look at the kismet nature of that. The fact that it was Easter, I didn't know what Easter was. It just happened to be on this Sunday. I only found out later that it even was Easter. So yeah, that to me is one of the biggest mysteries of my entire life. If you notice the language, I don't know if you noticed this, but this is interesting because we both have experience going to Dr. Joe retreat. That when I was 7 years old, I wasn't necessarily able to articulate it, but first I felt this loving feeling. And then when I was standing on the driveway, I felt like I was standing on this ethereal plane extending to infinity in every direction. Now, fast forward 46 years later, listening to Dr. Joe meditations, and now you're in the nothing, and it's all behind you and in front of you. It's the same thing. It's the void. It's eternity. It's a spiritual realm that we kind of open up to. And I was just blessed and lucky to perceive it and know it was there at such a young age. But these things are a mystery. My proclivity for spirit and how I was always talking to God. That medium happened to tell me, by the way, I don't know if this is true or not, but he told me that you probably were developing this in prior incarnations. And this work was something that you never really got to do. And he told me that this lifetime is when everything kind of aligns and you can do this work. I don't know. Sounds like at least a good working theory. Because how do you explain people in the same family? One believes in God, one thinks you're an idiot if you believe in God. They think I'm nuts, Nathan. This has not been easy for me. When I put out this book, it would have been easier if I told my family I was gay. Like they would have had an easier time with that if I was gay. Telling them I believe in God and I write about Christian theology, I lost my whole extended family instantly. And my own family is just like, you're nuts. It really alienated me from them. And then when I get to Dr. Joe, forget about it. That's it. You're done. So, but as I've said many times now, I lost some family and friends and gained a tribe. So, equitable trade.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is going back a little bit, and then I have some questions on kind of your perspectives on Jesus, but you had mentioned on your research for the book, you went and got a job, and then you were doing this research in the mornings, evenings, all the time you had outside of work. What was that like? Because I've been an entrepreneur for a few years now. I'm used to doing my own thing, and the idea of going into a traditional job scares the absolute crap out of me. How was that for you to make, because I assume you kind of made that commitment so that you'd be able to focus on this thing that was nagging at you, which was writing the book. What was that? Did it feel like a sacrifice? What was that situation like for you?
It was a major commitment. I was obsessed, but I was obsessed as an entrepreneur. And to my detriment too, Nathan, I've always been a driven person, and I've always wanted to be married and have kids and have a family. And here I am at 54. And, when I was an entrepreneur, it was build the business, grow the business, build the empire, more projects. And the same thing happened to me with the book. That became my obsession. So I was working, doing the book, and I pretty much had no life, and another 3 or 4 years floated by, but it was pretty crazy. When I took this job, I said to the man who offered me this job, I want to write this book. He needed somebody to take this job, and it was a total perfect marriage where I could just have a work where I didn't take home with me so that I could have these hours. But anything we're going to do, there is risk, and I always tell, a lot of people say to me now, oh, I want to write a book when they see my book. They're like, and I always say the same thing to people. I say that if you have to write this book or you are going to go insane, write it. Otherwise, I recommend not doing it because it is the toughest work. Anybody can write to infinity. It's the easiest thing to just keep on writing, to organize it into a book, paragraph by paragraph, chapter to chapter, the entire cohesive nature of it. You have to be willing to throw out brilliant lines, your favorite lines that you come up with. There's a term, they say, killing your babies. I would write the best paragraph I thought I ever wrote in my life, and my editor would write on the side, what the hell is this supposed to mean? It's just brutality. And everything superfluous has to go because you have to serve the stream. So it was a real discipline, and it was freaking tough, man. It's almost good that I didn't know how tough it was going to be because I might never have done it. I did a level of research that was like somebody going for a PhD. It was only when I spoke to Dr. Ehrman and you remember in my book, there's 2 chapters on the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. So some of the conclusions I come to in John, I thought that Dr. Ehrman was going to be blown out of the water. This guy has come up with things that nobody has ever come to before. And I'll never forget the first time I met with him, and I'm like, what'd you think about my Gospel of John? He's like, oh yeah, scholars have known that for a long time. About Jesus teaching that condemnation and salvation are in the present. That's the central theme of John. Apparently this had been around in scholarship for quite some time. But, it felt really good that I came to the right conclusions from my own research. But it's tough, Nathan. Any artist, actor, musician, you gotta be willing to go for it all, go for broke. But what's life about if not pursuing our passion,
Yeah. Getting back to Jesus and the concept of Jesus, so interesting. Here you were, you grew up in an atheist family, and then you start reading the Gospels, and you're just coming at it from did you start, I think you might have mentioned a little bit in the book. I mean, you did mention how you started going to church services and stuff. What was that like for you? Were you really consistent with that? Were you going even as a teenager by yourself? What was the approach to a traditional religious service for you?
That started in my 20s during college. When I was a teenager, I would watch televangelists. It's so funny. I never thought I'd be making an old man statement like this, but back in the day, before we had cable and all these streaming networks, you had ABC, NBC, and CBS, and then you had PBS, Channel 13, and a couple of other local stations. So, I would tune in to these guys who would be on Sunday, for an hour, and listen to them talk. And it wasn't so much that I was fascinated by the material. I was never Christian. Just honestly, it was never about that. I always almost sensed that Jesus was speaking in universal spiritual terms, and that the religion, what really got me going is that the religion and what I was hearing teached conflicted with what I saw in the Gospels. All this business about you're going to burn in hell if you don't believe in Jesus. I couldn't find it in the Gospels. That's how it all started. It's where is this? What are they talking about? And then when I got to college, I was such a seeker. Not just in Christian texts. I was studying Buddhism and Indian Vedic philosophy and All these books from ancient Greek philosophy, Stoic philosophy, all the big hitters in philosophy. I was a philosophy minor in college. So I would be fascinated to go to these different churches. I would go to one church in town that was, oh, let me see what Methodists are like. Let me see what the Catholic Church is like. I remember I once went to Southern Baptist to see I was the only white person in the church. And that was interesting, because they close the thing so no one can leave and then shut the doors. I was like, oh, what's going on here? That ended up being one of my favorite church experiences because I wasn't so much into the heavy hitting, like fire and brimstone preaching. But boy, oh boy, when they got on that organ and the gospel singers and the guitar, I was like, yeah, this is more God than anything I've experienced at church yet. I mean, being a huge rock and roll fan didn't hurt either. So, yeah, I used to hang on the words.
Frequency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think worship music was interesting for me coming back because I'm coming back into religion from a really odd perspective. Even though I had grown up in a kind of a Christian church, it was never super intense for my family, and
Hmm.
fell out of it. And then I'm now reapproaching it and from a completely different perspective. And coming back from the Dr. Joe event in those meditative states, the first time me and Taylor went to church again and there was worship music, and I just I just naturally kind of just went into my meditation stuff.
Hmm.
Frequency, man, like frequency's a real thing. I understand why music is so heavily correlated to religion, I totally believe you.
Yeah. Hey, can I just tap off my water here?
Go for it. So on Jesus, it seems like your perspective on him was more nuanced because you didn't grow up in like a really traditional Christian atmosphere and you were reading these other texts of yogis and different guides from different sort of takes on religion. Is that your perspective of Jesus? Because I think that's kind of come to be mine. Like it seems like this is just not just but like a very enlightened guide, similar to like a yogi of that time who was sharing wisdom as opposed to, I think, the kind of like mainstream traditional Christian philosophy where he's almost like a superhero that like commented towards Earth. You know what I mean? That you had like a Superman that you had to get behind. And you make good points in the book of like, you start getting into what is he actually meaning when he says through me or by believing in me. And I just thought that was a really
Yeah.
interesting take because he does well. I'm kind of getting off topic. My question to you is like, what is your perspective of him? Is he a guide?
Well,
Is he like when you think about him? What is that?
well, let me say first, it's funny that you happen to say, the Superman. I've never had any person catch this. I wonder if you caught this in the book. There's a point where I say, and then we took Jesus and elevated and pushed him way up high, up and away. That was
Mm.
that was a
Wow. Okay.
was a nod to Superman. However, what's really
Okay.
funny is that when one of the things that taught me a lot about what it says in the Gospels, there are two musicals that came out in the 70s that I watched, in the 80s when I was a teenager. Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell. Jesus Christ Superstar is my favorite musical ever written because not only are those words amazing and does it tell you the gospel story, but unlike musicals today, every single song is good in Jesus Christ Superstar. I mean, every note. Godspell is amazing also, the music, and it's all the gospel of Matthew and John. And isn't that interesting how the rock and roll and the good nature and the good music, what you were just saying, how much that conveys God. So that was very helpful for me. But the nature of Jesus, I mean, boy, that's a big one. So I think I told you there's a fantastic book, Autobiography of a Yogi, written by Paramahansa Yogananda. For many years, I would study Paramahansa's. He's the one who taught me how to meditate. I still meditate in the form that I learned from him. His story in an absolute nutshell is there's a line of gurus. He came out of India. He has a guru named Sri Yukteswar. Sri Yukteswar comes from Lahiri Mahashaya. Lahiri Mahashaya, their line, he includes Jesus in his line. And so even though you have this Indian, I don't even want to call it a religion because it's very universal for everybody. It's not so much a religion as just spiritual understanding. And Paramahansa really helped me because what happened was everything I had sort of been writing about Jesus, I got confirmed because Paramahansa Yogananda writes a lot about Jesus. He actually has a big, thick 2-volume set called The Second Coming of Christ, where he actually interprets all the verses in the gospel. It's immensely helpful. But Autobiography of a Yogi, that is a book I recommend to everybody. And it's the kind of book that sits on people's shelf for years, and then one day you're like, all right, I'm going to have at this. A lot of people, including myself, they get dismayed in the beginning because it's kind of boring in the beginning, to be honest. There's something like boring about it. And then all of a sudden, it gets so unbelievably fascinating, you cannot put it down. He tells these stories of miracles and wonders that almost make the Bible stories seem like tame in comparison. And this guy wrote this, I can't remember the year, maybe 1956, or maybe he died in 1956. Yeah, I think he died in 1956. But my point is the book is written recently. And the stories that he tells are not 2,000 years ago, they're recent. And so what he helped me to do is realize that there's this universality to spirit and spiritual teachings. And I came to realize that Jesus was as I had felt him to be, teaching these universal spiritual teachings. You know, it's funny, this whole thing of worshiping Jesus, of how the whole theology gets reduced to you believe in Jesus and you go up there, you don't believe and you go down there. As you know from my book, that theology does not exist in the Gospels. You can find 2 places, one in Luke, one in John, where Jesus does actually speak about a heaven. In John, he teaches about if you believe in Jesus, you can go to heaven. Never in the entire Bible will anybody ever find the sentence, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to burn in hell. It's not there. But what happened was, I began to, Jesus was empowering people. He was telling people, follow me. He was teaching people that it actually says in John 14:12, these things that I do, greater things shall you do, because I'm going to the Father. Which is basically saying, look, the Spirit is here for you to find. You're going to build on what came before, and you're going to do greater things than I did, because I'm out of here, and you're still here. But, you know, people kind of push that aside. He just said that to be a nice guy. He's the Messiah, after all. He didn't really mean it. And then, of course, critical scholars would tell you that all of John's gospel is written in a spiritual language and not literally what Jesus said anyway. Nevertheless, the point is that Jesus is teaching all of these universal messages. Seek and you will find the kingdom. Ask and you'll receive it. Knock and it will be opened. He's teaching about this present, eternal, spiritual place to find. When people just give up all their power and I'm just going to worship Jesus, all I have to do is believe in Jesus, there's nothing else to know, you miss all of this body of spiritual teaching that Jesus gave. It just doesn't matter, because if you only have to believe to get to heaven, what does it matter reading all of these teachings? What does any of it matter? You know, so I don't know, I hope I'm answering your question, but to who do I think Jesus is? Yes, I think he was one of the most, if not the most, advanced spiritual beings that walk the face of the earth. I don't know because I don't know everything that's gone on the planet Earth since the beginning of time. But I think it's safe to say that Jesus is the biggest influence on Western culture that ever was. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who has influenced the Western world. All of our art, culture, even music, so much of it came out of religious understanding and, the church, et cetera, et cetera. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question somewhat? It's a big question.
it does. No, it does. I think, and if I get you right, and this is kind of where I'm building my perspective on Jesus now. He, you have that line. Well, he says, like if you believe, there are these lines that it's basically like if you believe in Jesus, and I think that the context of those gets lost, and people do think you need to worship Jesus, and I think that I would guess if Jesus was here, he would say, "You got the wrong guy. I'm the messenger, not the thing.
Yes.
We're all bits of this thing." And so I think it's a bummer because it's not that, out of everything in scripture, to me it doesn't seem like that hard of a concept to undertake and to understand when we read things like if you believe in me, and to take the context of it and understand he means like believe what I'm saying, not treat me as God.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like that seems to like that to me seems to be like the missing link, I think, for I don't know, even maybe mainstream Christianity, where there's this Jesus
Yeah.
worshiping, and I think to a degree, I mean, he obviously, I agree with you.
Yeah.
There's too many ripples in the universe and the world right now that we live in, all these years later, to deny this man existed and had the biggest impact on the world.
And
But
you
yeah,
said it. Sorry, go ahead.
I just get, it's a new way for me to think about it, and it's funny because I get a little nervous speaking this way because you know what I mean? It can be so volatile
Yes.
when people have flipped the script and made Jesus the center of it.
Yeah. You said it really well before, casually. Jesus said, find God through him. He never says, seek me. He says, seek God. If you read in the Gospels, he's asked, what are the two most important commandments of all? And Jesus says, love God, love one another. I mean, you could boil everything he teaches down to that in terms of importance. He's teaching people to find God themselves. He says in Matthew, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and he will reward you. Probably, the early talk about meditation. You're seeking God is something you do on your own internally. And Jesus is, you're not, what a teacher. If you're going to have somebody as your teacher, as who to follow, this is what Jesus is teaching. And, it's the two components, love and mind. You'll notice in my book, love and seeking are kind of the two. It's almost like a yin-yang theme. We're to love one another. We're to live in our hearts. But there's also the part of us that has to use our minds and seek and think. It's always been amazing to me that, people believe in God, believe that we're created, believe God gave us a brain, and then he would say, now don't use it. Turn off your mind. Don't think. Don't search for the answers. Here are the answers. Believe in Jesus, and that's the meaning of life. People don't want to, God is not these long flowing robes and slowly lifted golden chalices. It's like God's in the nitty gritty details, humor, music, science, everything,
I remember that line in your book, God's not asking us to play stupid.
He doesn't ask any of
There's
us to
something
play
like that.
dumb.
Play dumb.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So you mentioned meditation. Again, that's something that, like, I grew up in the church. I never heard of meditation. Prayer, was asking really, really hard for something that you want, and in directing these thoughts and thinking. But there was no teaching on any sort of technique to get there or anything other than generate thoughts, which I think is interesting because in a way it's a little bit reversed of what meditation is. And then I
Hmm.
start reading the Bible and I have these deep meditation experiences, and I've kind of been going on my own journey on that. And I'm thinking, okay, I think what Jesus was doing when he's going off and praying is meditating. How did we lose that? Like what I'm just surprised by that right now in my kind of seeking journey, that church got kind of confused with the prayer and who to pray to. There's a lot of praying to
Yes.
Jesus, but we don't really see churches where people get together and have a proper meditation.
Right.
What's,
Right. Because
what's
because
your
because you're not supposed to think like that. You're not supposed to seek outside of everything to know about God is found in this book. That's what's taught. And it is just, it's incredible to think like that. And I'll tell you something else, Nathan, and I don't often talk about this, but this I learned directly from Paramahansa Yogananda, that a lot of the language Jesus speaks with, he makes a really good case that Jesus was talking about meditation. You've seen in Dr. Joe talking about the serpent. We see this serpent everywhere in Aztec culture, in Egyptian culture. We see the Kundalini energy is coiled up in the lower chakras and comes up like this. We see in Egyptian symbology, and on their statues, they have the cobra coming out of the third eye of the head. And it says, Jesus says in John that the Son of Man must be lifted up. That could be looked at as lifting up energy. The serpent must be lifted up. And the thing about going into the closet and I mean, going into your room and closing the door and praying. These things, there's another verse that's always been taken very apocalyptically, meaning that it was always taken to be strictly, this is the end of the world. He says, some of you standing here will see the kingdom come in power. Then parallel verses, within this generation you shall see the Son of Man. He could very well have been saying, and I happen to personally believe this, I can't know it, that what he meant was, if you follow my teachings and you seek God and you meditate, you are going to have this experience. You are going to find God. Like, people don't look hard at the language. So seek and you will find. Actually, everybody knows Jesus said it, but it actually comes from Deuteronomy 4:29, where it says, seek the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. I think that's what it says. I'm not sure. But the point being that seek and you will find. It's like, folks, look at what that is saying. You're going to find God. He didn't say seek and you'll meet God after you die in heaven. So much of what Jesus was teaching, it's like he was imploring people. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, right there. Just reach out. It's right there for you. We're like, nope, let's just believe in Jesus and go to heaven. It's like, that's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what Jesus taught. That's what the Church of Rome started teaching 100 years after Jesus died. It's quite amazing. It's some real matrix shit, so the church started teaching heaven and hell and this theology, and it just, nobody ever questioned it ever since, because you can't question God and Jesus and the Bible. Just believe this or else. The fear of hell prevented people from questioning the legitimacy of hell.
What's that gap like? I'm not familiar with it, between the introduction of hell from, the Romans, putting that in and kind of rewriting. What was the gap in between those like? Why do you think that this stuff happened?
Well, not Romans. The Church of Rome was like the first
Church of Rome. Yeah, sorry.
Catholic
Yep.
Church. That the Pope today is the result of that church. It's really interesting. So, like I was saying, if you want to take the Bible literally, which most people who believe it's the Word of God are doing, what Jesus is actually teaching is that there is, and I talk about this at length in my book, that Jesus never talks about an afterlife hell ever, not one sentence. He is talking at every turn about what's going to happen at the end of the world as we know it, the day of judgment, when the Son of Man, and the Gospels say it's Jesus, will return to bring in God's judgment of humanity. At that time, it says in Matthew that the king is going to separate all people. The righteous sheep are going to go on his right hand and the wicked goats on his left. And in Matthew, he says the wicked are going to go to the eternal fire, the furnace of fire, the fire of Gehenna, which is hell. And if you remember, the word hell is an English translation of the Greek word Gehenna, which is a translation of the Hebrew word Gehinnom, which is a very real valley outside Jerusalem. You can take a bus tour of it today. And so what Jesus was saying, that this is where the wicked are going to go at the end of the world. And what's more, he never, ever, ever, ever says that the wicked are going to suffer for all eternity. We just invented that. It's not in the Bible. This thing about people are going to burn in fire forever. What the Gospels actually say, that the wicked will be destroyed in the fire. He actually uses the word destroyed 3 times. We just don't pay attention to the fact. He says, just like it was with Sodom and Gomorrah, when it was destroyed, Sodom was destroyed. Just like everyone was destroyed with Noah and the flood, he says in Luke, it will be like that when the Son of Man comes. So this thing we call hell of afterlife suffering for all of eternity, it just does not exist in every level. The only hell he's talking about is at the end of the world, and the wicked are going to be destroyed. The good people, the righteous, he says, are going to live the earth is going to be restored to an Eden-type place. People are going to be immortal. There's going to be no more death, no more disease, no more evil people, no more wicked people, no more suffering of any kind. Now, that's if you look at the Bible literally. I happen to believe that a lot of that is metaphorical, and Jesus was giving these profound messages about how you would suffer if you were living in sin. I do think that Jesus spoke about a judgment, like that eventually humanity would be judged by its own actions. And we could say that in our individual lives, if we look at something as a judgment when we die. I study a lot of NDEs for my next book, and one of the universal things that a lot of people say is that there's no judgment when you get there. What happens is you have a life review. That you're in this environment of love, and what you really experience is the ways that you affected people. If you were good to people, you see the ripple effect. If you were bad or harm someone, you would see the ripple effects of that. So, everything Jesus is teaching according to sort of spiritual correctness, it doesn't have to do with this God and judgment and fire and brimstone. It was just never about that. But you only know that if you really read the Gospels cover to cover, and most people don't do that. It's not like it's an easy read, It took me, everything I'm saying to you right now took me decades of study and research and soul searching to find.
It seems like, a big line that sums up what you've been talking about is this concept of punished by your sins, not for your sins. If you take the meta approach to that, that's kind of the crux of a lot of this.
I feel like I'm not letting you ask me enough questions, though. Sorry if my answers are too long.
These are great. I really appreciate your thoughts, because I think that it was just really cool to read a book like this and have it be, you were just authentically curious about the subject, and you don't take like a moral high ground on it, and you also don't pretend that you've been like a scholar on this since you were 2 years old, and you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it was just like genuinely like a labor of love, and then you went the extra mile to validate anything, everything that you could.
And to not
And
take anything
I,
away from people, to say at every turn, like,
yeah,
look it up for yourself. Don't take my word for it.
no, there's no judgments, and I think that's what's kind of cool about it to me is it feels like you invite somebody to stand next to you and look at what you're observing, and just to see, you know what I mean? Just to see what it's like. And I think that's a really cool approach just to anything religious, because there's no way one human being knows for sure. The only thing we can do is share our perspectives and
And
put work into those.
I hope if I did my job well that you had some of your fears alleviated through documentation, and that what you're left with is realizing the love that Jesus was teaching. It's like it's love or it's crap. It's like if it ain't love, it ain't God. And that's what his teachings are showing. And it's just when you really begin to look through this lens of love. Remember, I said it at one point in that chapter in The Voice, how love is the divining rod. It's the rule by if you can accept that we have a God of love who is love. It's like this, it gives you this access to know, is this the truth or is this bullshit? Is this about loving one another and coming together, or is this about fear mongering? Is this about saying how I believe is right? And this, I used to teach more Bible studies than I do now. And I remember at one Bible study, I heard this group of women talking, and they're like, oh, the Muslims, the Muslims, this. And I got up to the podium and I changed my whole tack and I said, Jesus taught to love your enemies. And it's like, if you're walking around thinking that a third of the planet Earth, or a quarter of the planet Earth, 2 billion Muslims, for example, are all these, people who are going to hell, or for that matter, the 3/4 of the world that's not Christian, it's like if they don't believe how we believe, they're all going to hell. You're telling 6 billion people that they're going to burn in hell because they don't believe like you do. And then, you go to the Middle East and you have 2 billion Muslims who think all the Christians are infidels and they're all going to die on Judgment Day. I mean, that's half the planet Earth right there. And it's like, I always say to people, Jesus preached, do not judge, and you will not be judged, and do not condemn others. What is judging and condemning people more than saying if they don't believe how we believe, they're going to burn in hell? It's like God does not speak in ultimatums like that. And I try to show in my book, that that's not what Jesus was teaching. It's certainly not what God was saying to me in that material in The Voice.
Do you think that got misinterpreted in, like, I think of, missionary work, right? And somebody might have the perspective of, no, that's true. That's why we really need to hit the ground hard and share the gospel and save these people. But do you think that was misinterpreted? Because you're right, when Jesus was around, he was constantly on the move. He was never like establishing himself as king. He did not say, hey, we're going to gather around, we're Christians now, and there's an in group and an out group. Let's get everybody on the in group. It was very much like, this is accessible to everybody. I mean, like, I think about now that I'm learning about other gurus throughout history, or teachers and people that just had a bigger connection to source, it seems like they're all talking about the same thing. What crossed people's wires there? Because you're right, when I read the Bible now, it seems really clear that the intent was not to have him be the focus and to have an in-group, out-group. It was more of like, hey, here's what I've discovered on a human level.
Yeah.
Here's how you can attain it.
There's obviously I love every line in the book, but there's like 6 to 10 lines that are my favorite lines in the book. And one of my like top 3 favorite lines in the book, how did any race or religion ever get to a place where we said, believe in the eternal loving light of the only Son, or we'll kill you? Or we'll put you on a rack and stretch you to death until you confess the name of the loving Lord. It's like, oh my God. So yeah, no, Jesus was never teaching any such thing ever. In fact, that you could say that's the most valid historical reason why he got killed, was because they brought him to trial in Rome, and he was tried for sedition because they're looking at him as the king of the Jews who's going to lead a revolt. And the Jewish Messiah was supposed to be a Davidic king who was going to, he was either going to be a warrior king or this all-powerful king who was going to overthrow the oppressors, free Israel, free the Jews, and rule the world. When Jesus was crucified, being crucified is the most humiliating, lowest, worst way anyone could have died. And this is where the entire rift between Judaism and Christianity began, because so many of the Jews said, wait a minute, the Messiah doesn't get crucified. That's not how it works. And so Christianity had to find this way of making this all work. And that's when we came up, the Messiah had to suffer. He had to suffer our pains. They actually annexed Jewish scripture that had nothing to do with Jesus. And that's a long story, though. I'm sorry. That really gets into the weeds. But it just goes to say that this business of Jesus being the king who is going to be this radical, Jesus, he taught love. He taught nothing like that. So, really went off the rails quite a bit.
No, I think that was great. I mean, it seems like you agree. From this perspective, I mean, you read the Bible and there's so many stories where he's actually intentionally dialing down the hype when it gets too much around him.
Yeah.
And you would think that if it was really the case that we needed to save everybody by getting them to believe in Jesus, that Jesus would, if that made sense, Jesus would have never traveled around and kind of escaped crowds in the way that, the Bible.
Do you know, Nathan, that in the first 3 Gospels, Jesus never says, I am God. Not once. Kind of an important thing for him to leave out, if that was the case. That we only see that in John 4 times, where Jesus says, I am. He goes, I and the Father are one. The sentence that people don't want to pay attention to is a few chapters later when he says, the Father is greater than I. And I love explaining this because it seems to be a contradiction, but it's not. If we look at the soul or the Christ within as a puddle of water, the puddle of water is then in the ocean that is God and Spirit. And so I am one and the same, and yet God is infinitely more. For Jesus to, even when he said, I am, which is the term for God taken from Exodus, I am. When Moses says, who shall I tell has sent me, he said, I am sent you. He was giving a spiritual understanding according to what he knew of himself. And I think that the very gospel he was teaching, and gospel means good news, the good news was that the kingdom is here for everybody. The kingdom of God is here for you right now, and here's how to find it. And he teaches in all these parables the nature of the kingdom of God so that you could find the kingdom of God, so that you would have these ways to relate to the kingdom of God. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the very gospel Jesus taught. Follow me, learn from my teachings. I will guide you how to find God. Again, it was never worship me. That's the meaning of life. Never.
Yeah. Wow. When we talk about Jesus, it seems like then the only contradiction then to that viewpoint from a traditional Christian religion perspective would then be the Virgin Mary birth kind of being this kind of the beginning of the Superman story for this. Is there any backstory on that you found in kind of as you've done your scholarship on this stuff of
Yeah.
where that kind of came out? Because if that wasn't part of the story, I think a lot more people could get on board with this part of, Jesus was actually just a very, very extremely well connected guide to source, but was still a human, to a degree. He wasn't meant to be the thing to worship. But the Virgin Mary birth story seems to kind of be the one thing that still pulls at that. What's the story behind that? Have you found
Well,
anything with that?
first of all, I forgot to connect the dots earlier when we were talking about Superman, that the musical is called Jesus Christ Superstar. You got to watch it
Yeah.
if you've never seen it. Watch it
I
with
will.
Taylor.
I haven't seen it.
It's all about Jesus Christ Superstar. But anyway, the virgin birth. So this is one of those things, Nathan, where I would never say it didn't happen because I don't know. What I will say is that it's only in 2 of the 4 Gospels, which I always found incredible because it's only found in Matthew and Luke, and you would think this is kind of an important thing for them to have left out in the other Gospels. But a lot of people don't realize that the Gospels are 4 individual books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're written in different times, different places, by different authors, and each book has their agenda. And so people think, oh, the virgin birth, it's a story that's just in the Bible. It doesn't work that way. It's in 2 of the Gospels. It's not in 2 other ones. Kind of like the whole nativity story with Christmas. It's like this story does not exist in the Gospels. What it is elements of all the different stories mashed together to give us this story. You have the wise men from Matthew. Anyway, so the virgin birth, who's to say? It's a very beautiful, poetic, spiritual, metaphorical story, much like Adam and Eve. But I will tell you, Paramahansa Yogananda proclaimed that the virgin birth happened because he proclaims that there's other yogis in India who were born of a virgin birth. But I don't know. I'm just kind of giving you the data. But there's a scholarly argument that I hesitate to say because I'm not sure I can say it properly, but I think in Hebrew there's a word alma that means a young woman. And that word gets sort of mistranslated and brought in to mean virgin. It has something to do with how it went into Greek and how this Greek writer was misinterpreting a Hebrew word, something like that. So there's a case to be made that it was a misunderstanding out of the gate. But the way I view these things, Nathan, is I view this the same way I view Jesus walking on water, the same way I view all the miracles. These things should not be the basis of anyone's faith. They should be things that inspire us, like who knows what's possible in this world? A virgin birth may very well be something that could have happened for somebody, such an incredible spiritual being. Maybe he's reincarnated and progressed to that. I don't know. Did Jesus walk on water? I don't know. I would be a fool to say that didn't happen or to say that did happen. This need that people have to say, the virgin birth happened. He definitely walked on water. It's like, you don't know that. It's this thing of fear and ego that makes us think we have to proclaim. In my opinion, Nathan, it would be an absolutely like a mad God to tell any of us that I hereby order you to believe in something that you can never know the answer to. I mean, that would be a really crazy world if that were the case.
Told to you by centuries of banana phone through humans.
Right. And it's like, it's really not to say that it didn't happen, but it should, in my opinion, it shouldn't matter. The teachings of Jesus stand like on their own. Remember when I said in my book, like, what would your opinion of Jesus be if there were no miracles? Would you still listen to what he said? Would he still have... Do you know that it's a very good historical argument that Christianity came to be because people believed in the resurrection? Never mind whether it happened or not. People believing in it. That's what made Christianity happen. Otherwise, it just would have been another sect of Judaism. The early Christians, Jesus was Jewish, all the disciples were Jewish. This is another thing that, like, when I've taught Bible studies and I mention this, like, you can feel the energy in the room. People are like, they don't like to be reminded of that because they're like, Jesus wasn't Jewish. He superseded his Judaism, as if it takes anything away from him. Jesus says in Matthew that you are to follow the law from what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish law. He says not one letter, not one stroke of a pen of a letter is to be denied. And so these were Jewish Christians. The early Christians, they were Jewish Christians. Jesus didn't create any new religion. He said you need to follow the Mosaic law. And then, it grew up and out of there. Paul was very much responsible for saying you don't need the law anymore. But the point I'm making is that, that Jesus and everyone operating in this sect of Judaism, it sort of wouldn't have gone anywhere if the belief in the resurrection, that's what made everything boom, just explode. To this day, a lot of people will tell you you're not a Christian if you don't believe in the resurrection. It says in, I think, Romans, that you have to confess that Jesus resurrected or you're not Christian, basically. Jesus didn't teach that. Jesus didn't say, by the way, there are lines in the Gospels, in the early Gospels, where he says, I'll return in 3 days. Very iffy. They seem kind of jammed in there among his teachings. Very iffy whether he said that. But even if he did say that, he never says, and by the way, if you don't believe that I came back in 3 days, you're not getting into heaven. Again, it's just another thing that's not in the Bible that we created later.
Mm-hmm. I really like your perspective on that in the book when you ask that. If there were no miracles, what would your perspective still be? That's a cool question to ask.
Yeah, very important one, because the teachings should stand on their own.
Yeah. So could I ask you some more just on your journey into meditation with all this religious context you have?
You can ask me anything you like.
When I went to the Dispenza retreat, me and Taylor were like, we had just started going to church again. We were like looking around after the first meditation, or maybe it wasn't the first one, but you get a few days in and people are having really big moments. Sometimes it sounds like an exorcism. It scared the crap out of me. I was terrified. And me and Taylor are looking at each other and we're like, is this of God? Like we felt kind of like guilty almost, And then, the more we go down that rabbit hole, the more similarities I find between these teachings of meditation and stuff that Jesus said. The eye of the needle. I mean, there's just we could just go on and on about these kind of similarities and what they might actually mean now with the context of deep meditation. What's your viewpoint on meditation and the Bible and Jesus? What kind of connections do you make when you kind of look at these two worlds that for whatever reason today seem to be separate? There's Christian religion that is very I don't know, by the book, worship Jesus, and then there's like meditation, which is actually, it seems like prayer, what Jesus was actually doing. And so there's this little divide there, but there's so many similarities. What's your take on that?
You mean on meditation?
Yeah, and how it dovetails with, Jesus' teachings. Like, are you having moments in these, during these Dispenza retreats or things like that, where you're hearing things he's saying in a secular context that you're like, oh, that actually is exactly what Jesus said at this part of the Bible?
Absolutely. Every once in a while, he'll say something from the Gospels. Yeah, I can't remember. He quoted Matthew. He quoted the last retreat I was in, but I can't remember exactly what the quote was. But yeah, as I said earlier, I think that it's all the same. I mean, what's going on in meditations at Dr. Joe is, in my opinion, exactly what Jesus was teaching. What are we doing when we're meditating? I mean, we're seeking via letting go. We let go to something more. And that's when, he constantly teaches about moving into the unknown. And that is so brilliant because what's that's doing, it's teaching the nuts and bolts of meditation. The new frontier, the unknown is always the unknown. It's like if we're in this ship and we're moving forward, we're always moving into unknown waters. And so the only way to come to know those unknown waters is to surrender to the fact that they're unknown. If you know where you're going, if you know, then you're back in the known. So the only way you can move forward is to surrender completely everything you know. I always say that this is just my take on this, that there's no such thing as getting better at meditation. We get more experienced at meditation because I don't care. Like I can't tell you the hours, Nathan, that I've spent meditating in the last 30 plus years. And every single time I sit down, that doesn't matter. It's me with me. The same old things might come up. My body might still try to take me out. Just this morning, I was meditating and my mind is saying to me, let's just skip today. Let's go get an egg sandwich. Yeah. Let's go get a Red Bull. Yeah. It's okay. You meditate every day. And I'm just like, nope, we're staying right here. But just the fact that still happens sometimes. Not all the time, but this morning was funny. I just did not feel like meditating. But I stayed there anyway, and such great rewards tend to happen, I find, in those meditations. But for me, that's what seeking is. That's what knock and it will be opened. Ask and you will receive. Let's look at this in the Joe Dispenza terminology. Seek the unknown and you will find. Now you will have added to your known more knowledge of God, more knowledge of spirit, more knowledge of yourself. Ask and you will receive. You're going to receive the next wave of information, the next download. Knock on the door of this kingdom, of this realm of eternity, and it's going to open for you. So to me, meditation is sort of the purest form of seeking God. I've had revelations when I'm walking around. I've had them happen if I'm in a movie theater. But by and large, most of my journeying and finding has happened through meditation because it's just you and whatever more there is.
When you get downloads, you've been getting those for a long time now, throughout your life, even before, really diving heavily into maybe what you consider meditation now. But it's, you were doing that even when you were a child. It sounds like, when it was time to shut all the lights off and, you were feeling that. When it comes to downloads, I think the frustrating thing for me personally is that I want to hear the downloads in plain English. And I think sometimes it happens and it's invisible. What's your, you've had some good downloads that I think are stuff that people aspire to have and think that that's what a real one is. Have you had other downloads where it was almost kind of subconscious to you and you just kind of noticed it after the fact? It wasn't this kind of booming voice, it was just a feeling? Or like what are some of the different types of downloads you experience?
They're all like that. Remember when I said it's like learning an instrument and you sort of get better as you go? It's very hard to discern the download from your own voice.
Mm-hmm.
But there's certain things that you sort of get better at, like all of a sudden you start receiving wisdom that relates to maybe a problem you're having, or you start having insight about something, or you start, and here's a big telling, like if you ever come to a spiritual conclusion and then you have a synchronicity that validates that piece of information, like for example, there was one time when I got this download about the information in the Gospel of John and what it meant. And I wrote this all down. This was when I was working on my book. I'll never forget this. I walked over to my bookshelf. It's somewhere right here. And there's a book called The Yoga of Jesus. It's a Paramahansa's little like cliff notes to his big volume work. And this was crazy. I had this thing happen the very next day. I picked this book up off my shelf. I open up the book, and almost verbatim to what I wrote the night before was right here. And it was like, wham. It was this major validation. I don't for one second think I'm anywhere in the same solar system of a developed soul as Paramahansa Yogananda, but the fact that I wrote the same words that he wrote showed me I was moving in the right direction. And I think things like that happen, and not just to me, to everyone. And I think when you receive information, it's just a matter of the more you do it, the more you're going to be able to discern it from your thoughts. I find another telling sign is when something comes out of the void. Like you're in nothing, you're in a deeply meditative state, and all of a sudden it's like information. That's when I perk up and pay attention. Like all of a sudden information comes out of nowhere. That's when you really pay attention. And sometimes it is going to be your own rambling thoughts. But when it comes like void to something really important or powerful, I think that's a telling sign. But yeah, it's like we said, learning to play the piano. You're going to, I think, there's a great writer named Neil Donald Walsh who wrote a book called Conversations with God. And one of the things I love that he says in this book, he says, God is talking to everyone. The question is, who's going to listen?
Wow. Did you ever have fear with this stuff? I was terrified in the Dispenza stuff early on. And to be honest, like even throughout my whole first retreat, I was approaching every meditation with like trying to get over that fear. Were you ever scared of this?
Are you kidding me? I'm terrified for years and years and years and years. Do you mean of just everything in general or the actual what happens in meditation?
Everything. I mean, just this whole world. But I think, when I asked that question, I initially just meant meditation, even just sitting there and getting these feelings and these deep things and battling, having your ego start talking.
It's funny, Nathan? Like everybody wants to find God, so they say. But when we find it, we're fucking terrified. I mean, it is so unknown and so foreign to us that it's been so funny with Joe Dispenza for me, because I found that the times when all of a sudden, this is really powerful, there's guidance, as we've spoken about, and I've almost gotten more in tune with my guidance since going to Joe. The last retreat I went to, I almost got conversational with my guide, where I got so adept at activating my pineal gland that I've almost given my guide a way to say one thing to me: yes. So I come to a spiritual conclusion, and then all of a sudden my pineal starts vibrating. It's like, whoa. That happened to me a lot at the last retreat. And the first time my pineal gland ever activated was at my first retreat that I went to with you. And it was really fascinating, because what happened was the tension, like the spiritual tension of the unknown coming, built. And I started getting very scared. And this voice inside said to me, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And it's funny, because it happened again when I went to the advanced follow-up retreat. That happened to me again during the Body Electric, where I started feeling terror. And the funny thing is, Nathan, if you remember that one, you're on the ground and he's going through 1, 2, 3, 4 up the energy centers. When he said 1, terror overtook me. When he got to 2, you can imagine where I'm going. By the time we got to 5, but again, this voice was saying to me, like, don't be afraid. This is why you came. But the new and the unknown can be so big and so unknown, we almost can't help but fear. And we have to kind of master that fear, because that's usually when the biggest, most incredible spiritual breakthroughs happen, at least in my experience. Now I'm at the point, Nathan, where it's like, I'm afraid. And I'm like excited and afraid at the same time, because I know what that means. But you got to be so careful with the universe, because it's like, careful what you wish for, son, because, I still have that. I've gotten so much better at bringing up energy that I've gotten very afraid several times, even in the past week, because it was so overwhelming. I passed out for the first time. That was scary as hell. I was at a public beach, and I was standing up and I was holding this guardrail. And this guardrail was always like, what to hold on to if I start feeling a little like I'm going. And so I brought up energy so well. The next thing I knew, I'm on the ground holding this. I pulled this whole guardrail over on myself, and these two ladies are frantically trying to get this guardrail off of me. And I am sitting there with this big shit-eating grin on my face, and these ladies are looking at me like, you are the Antichrist. Because I was like, the energy was just, there was a part of me that was like, wow, I finally kind of crossed this line of complete being overtook. But it's been scary since then, I gotta tell you. We can calm down. We can like go after it a little less, with a little less verve.
Yeah.
But welcome a little bit of the unknown and the fear. I'm telling you, that's where it's at.
I was driving today I was listening to this, it was Van Morrison, Into the Mystic. You know that song?
Yeah.
I pulled over and I just started crying. And there's that line of like the foghorn, and I want to hear it. I don't have to fear it.
Yeah.
Oh
That's
my
funny.
gosh,
I've heard that song 100 times, and I never kind of thought about those lyrics before. Yeah.
it hit me so hard. And the whole mystic thing, when I went to that Dispenza retreat, I wanted to heal. I was having a lot of physical health stuff. I wasn't there for a mystical experience. Like this whole mystic stuff, I was like, it wasn't on my radar at the time. Now I've come to find out those two things aren't separate. Jeez, yeah, the whole mystic stuff, man, it's just crazy how deep this thing goes. And when you
Yeah.
were when you had your moment and you passed out, were you doing the breath? What were you like working on at the
I was
time
doing the
that led to
breath.
that?
Yeah. I had done a few breaths, and then I did like some inhale exhales. The inhale exhales are what get me every time. It's almost like bringing up the energy is priming, and then the inhale exhale, that's what really makes my pineal go. Yeah.
How was your last retreat? Because that would have been your third, right? You did the Dallas, you did the advanced follow up, and then
It was so
what was new
remarkable.
this time?
Well, so I told you that before the first retreat, I had been pursuing the pineal gland like with vigor. I learned from Dr. Joe at the first retreat that I had been trying too hard. But I've been like a mad scientist, making my own pineal meditations and really going after it. At the last meditation, at the last retreat, I learned that I needed to embrace the feminine more, feeling, letting go, the emotion of the breath, having the passion about wanting to breath. In other words, not just tighten this, do this, da da da, not all the mechanics and making this thing happen. I was so caught up in the mechanics that I was forgetting to let in the feeling. And brother, when I let it go, I went through this progression where I was lifting up the energy, Nathan, and an amazing thing happened. I started having so much fun that like instead of just bringing the energy to the pineal, I eventually was like throwing up the energy through 8, and eventually it was like I felt like I was playing with a baby, like up the baby, and then I realized, oh, this is like a little toddler, it's me. And sure enough, it's pretty crazy, Nathan. I never thought I was going to be one of these people who like shakes and convulses, but he's bringing us up in the pineal gland, and I got so good at bringing up the energy that my hands froze together, like they were stuck together, like I was being electrocuted, and my whole body starts shaking. The music is going, va, 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 va. It was intense. And so that was very different. I learned a lot more about bringing up the energy. And it's so interesting because just like Dr. Joe is a conductor of a symphony of energy in the room, we become musicians. Like everyone has to find their own rhythm. Like I can tell you everything I do, and it might help you, and we help each other with these little tips. But then we have to find it ourselves, and we become these musicians. And I find that I'm bringing up the energy, and it's like there's something else happening that's not physical, it's not in a real reality dimension, that we're controlling this thing that's in another sort of dimension, this energy that I'm bringing up. I can't explain it, but I know how to bring up this energy now because I've been a good student of doing this. And I'm fascinated at the progression of learning. You know, it's practice, 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 practice. You know, I do it every day. And, but now that I've sort of combined like sort of the yin yang, masculine, feminine, so to speak, I've really stepped into my own. And that was the big difference at this retreat. And because I had spent so much work and become so adept at activating my pineal, like I said, Spirit was able to communicate with me a lot more. And it was, and the synchronicities and the things that happened. We saw 2 people in wheelchairs get up at this retreat. I'm not talking about people who sometimes walk and sometimes don't. These were people who hadn't walked in years. One of them was in, I don't think she was paraplegic, but she was in one of those paraplegic chairs, and she couldn't speak. She was just a slur. And at the end of the retreat, she was sort of able to speak a little bit, and she got up and walked. It was incredibly powerful. Wow. So that was different.
And how is it doing like another week long? Or is it the same material and you're just able to approach it with a new lens and just soak up more? Because I could watch the whole presentation again, you know, do the whole week
Yes.
probably 50 times and still pick up new stuff. How was it sitting in another week long?
It's absolutely like that. Like, you know what? You know how if there's a movie you really love, you can keep watching it over and over. You're always getting new stuff, and it's that kind of thing. Like, there are things that Dr. Joe said in this, and I just kept saying to myself, has he always said this? Did he say this in the last retreat? Because now suddenly, because you have this basis, now you're open to hear other things that you might have missed before. And so, but the thing that I found that is the number one mistake people make leaving these retreats is that they stop meditating. And I find that I always use this analogy that it's like, think of the pillars on a bridge, and think of the retreats as pillars, or think of even important spiritual times of your life. You have these spans in between, and that's what doing the work is, that you have to maintain these spans in between the pillars. So if you stop meditating after a retreat, what's going to happen is that then when you go to the retreat, you're going to have to, you do all this work to get back to baseline. But if you keep on doing meditations, you arrive sort of here, and you're going to go here now. I think that it's only natural that no matter what, you're going to backslide a little with vibration. Because you have life, you have reality, you have doing your work. That's why I think like 2 meditations a day is 3 hours is my magic number. Whether it's 2 meditations or 3 meditations or 2 hours in the morning, 1 at night. It is not easy to find that time, I know. Unfortunately, the good and the bad news is that right now I don't have a family. I still would like to have that. But because I have all my time, the one silver lining is I'm able to spend 3 hours a day meditating. So yeah, I think you keep on growing with retreats. And the people I speak to who have been to like 9 retreats, it's like, there's a reason. They keep on going. It's so funny, like I'm now one of those people. You know, 80% of the people is always always new people. And they say to you, why do you come back? Why are you going? And I look at them and I'm like, because it sucks. You know, it's like, obviously I'm coming back because it's just amazing and new frontiers are happening every time.
Do you feel those moments, the same moments resonating throughout the room since so many people there are the first time. Like I remember the moment that he starts explaining on the whiteboard and he starts doing the frequencies, climbing up the energy centers and connecting those things. I mean, like you could just feel it in the room of like that connecting with people.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that actually. You know, me and Taylor looked at each other in that moment. We're like, oh,
Yeah, that's the moment where it's like, bleh. Everything's like,
yeah.
everything merges into one at that moment. And but yeah, even those diagrams, I picked up things in a new way that I never had. So, and I always feel like, Nathan, like in my mind, this is the edge of the cutting edge.
Hmm.
Like it really is in every way, with the coherence healings, with meditation. It's just an incredible thing that's going on. And it's easy to take for granted, like that when you're there, you're part of the cutting edge. You're part of Dr. Joe has improved certain things. He's constantly evolving, constantly improving. And you're part of the experiment that's giving him feedback. Like he told us at this last retreat that he had upgraded the pineal meditation. Like, you think any of us actually knows what those upgrades were? I can tell you that I could have sworn that we were done lying down, and then he got us up for this bonus round that I think was much more severe than the first retreat, but I don't know. I can't really remember. But now, he's gonna now that upgrade that he just made, he got his feedback from the room, and now he's gonna take that to the next retreat and tweak it and tweak and tweak. So it's really it's an amazing, beautiful, and adventurous thing, I find. So full of wonder and magic, and I tell you, the love. Like, not since back in the day when I was going to Grateful Dead shows have I ever felt collective love like that in one place. Maybe like a church on Christmas. That times 100, is sort of the feeling that you feel. No religion involved, like just the spirit of people gathering together when there's at your wedding, that feeling of love, just with 2,000 people in a room. I haven't found that anywhere else since the Grateful Dead back in the day. Jerry Garcia was my
That's
first Dr. Joe.